Whispers of the Unspoken. The night was thick with fog, the city around it shrouded in an unsettling quiet, broken only by the occasional echo of footsteps along the cracked cobblestone streets. A full moon hung overhead, but its light barely managed to penetrate the haze that swallowed the world below. In an old, creaking building, buried in the heart of the city, a girl named Eleanor sat alone in a room she had claimed as her sanctuary for months. The air around her seemed heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She was on the verge of something important, something terrifying. Eleanor had always been a girl of few words, an observer, not a participant. She preferred to stay in the shadows, watching the world from the periphery. She was quiet, reserved, and above all, afraid of what others might say, afraid of rejection, afraid of being herself. Her life had been built on the idea of safety, of never standing out, of never giving anyone a reason to look too closely. It was easier that way, safer. But tonight was different. Tonight, Eleanor had made a choice. She was going to speak her truth, to let the world hear her voice, even if it meant standing before a crowd, exposing herself in a way that felt impossible. She had heard about a poetry competition, an opportunity to express herself, to finally be heard. It was a small, local contest, nothing grand, but to Eleanor it felt like the biggest thing in the world. She had written her poem weeks ago, hesitated, revised, and then hesitated some more. But now, she was here, in her room, heart pounding in her chest, ready to face the decision that had been tormenting her for months. She picked up the paper from the desk and read the words once again. The poem was raw, so raw that it hurt to read. It spoke of the fear she had carried with her for as long as she could remember, the fear of judgment, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of never being seen. It was a reflection of her soul, a part of her she had buried deep, afraid that it would be too much for anyone to understand. But in that moment, she knew she had to share it. She couldn't keep hiding forever. She stood up from the desk and walked to the window, staring out at the mist that hung over the city. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for her decision. The silence was oppressive, but there was also a strange comfort in it, a quiet whisper that seemed to be urging her to move forward. "Just do it," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. With a deep breath, Eleanor grabbed her coat and stepped into the cold night air. Her footsteps were soft against the ground as she made her way to the competition venue. It was an old, Gothic building, the kind that seemed to exist in a different time, with towering arches and intricate stone carvings. As she entered, the smell of dust and aged wood filled her nostrils. The room was dimly lit, filled with rows of chairs and a small stage at the front. A crowd had gathered, some chatting in low voices, others standing nervously by the walls. Eleanor's heart pounded louder with every step she took, her hands trembling as she clutched the paper with her poem. The moment she stepped into the room, all eyes turned to her. A jolt of panic surged through her chest, but she pushed it down, forcing herself to move forward. She took a seat in the back, hoping to remain unseen, but there was no escaping the feeling that everyone was watching her. She was too aware of her every movement, every breath. Her mind raced with thoughts of how foolish she must look, how ridiculous, how vulnerable. She was sure that everyone could see right through her, could see the fragile girl she was, the one who was afraid of her own voice. But then, as the competition began, something strange happened. The words of the other participants filled the air, words that were beautiful and powerful, but also full of fear, of longing, of hope. It was as though each poet was speaking the truth of their own hearts, and in that moment, Eleanor realized something. She wasn't alone. She wasn't the only one who had been hiding, who had been afraid to let the world see who they really were. One by one, the poets took the stage, and as they spoke, Eleanor's own fear began to melt away. The world around her seemed to shrink, and she found herself drawn to the stage, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. When her name was called, she stood, her legs unsteady, her breath shallow. The eyes of the room were all on her, and for a moment, she wanted to run. But then she remembered the words she had written, the words that had come from the deepest parts of her soul. With shaking hands, she stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent. She cleared her throat and began to speak. The words came out haltingly at first, unsure, but as she spoke, something inside her began to shift. The poem flowed from her, raw and unfiltered, every word carrying the weight of the fears and desires she had never been able to express. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor didn't care what anyone thought. She was no longer afraid. When she finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Eleanor stood there, her heart in her throat, her palms sweating. She didn't know what the others thought, didn't know if they understood, if they cared. But as she looked around the room, she saw something that surprised her. There was no judgment, no ridicule, just a quiet respect. The other poets smiled gently, their eyes full of understanding. It was as though they had all been on this journey together, and they, too, had felt the fear of exposing themselves to the world. The competition continued, but Eleanor couldn't focus on anything else. She had already won. She had spoken her truth. She had faced her fear. When the winners were announced, Eleanor's name was not called. She hadn't won the competition, but it didn't matter. She didn't need a prize to validate her. She had gained something far more valuable, a sense of self-respect, a newfound confidence that she had never known before. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor began to change. She no longer hid in the shadows, no longer feared the opinions of others. She started to speak up, to share her thoughts, to express herself in ways she had never allowed herself to before. She wrote more poetry, poured her emotions onto the page, and for the first time, she didn't worry about whether it was good enough. It was hers, and that was enough. But the world was not without its darkness. Late one evening, as Eleanor walked home from work, she was followed by a figure in the mist, a man whose face she couldn't see, but whose presence was chilling. Her heart raced as the figure grew closer, his footsteps heavy against the cobblestone. He was not alone. There were others, shadows that seemed to shift and pulse in the fog. Eleanor's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs were frozen, her body too paralyzed by fear to move. The man spoke, his voice low and raspy. "You shouldn't have done it." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, the words hitting her like a blow. She tried to back away, but the shadows closed in around her, trapping her in the darkness. "You're not safe anymore," the man continued, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You dared to speak your truth. You dared to be seen. And now you will pay the price." But as the shadows reached for her, something inside Eleanor snapped. She wasn't the same girl who had stepped into the poetry competition months ago. She had found her voice. She had faced her fear. And she was not going to let this man, or anyone, silence her again. With a surge of strength, Eleanor shouted, "Leave me alone." Her voice echoed through the fog, powerful and unyielding. The shadows faltered, recoiling from her words as if they were tangible. The man took a step back, his eyes widening in surprise. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt in control. The shadows vanished, and the man disappeared into the night, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the cold, silent street. Her heart was still pounding, but there was no fear, only the quiet, steadfast knowledge that she could face whatever came next. As Eleanor walked home, the fog seemed to lift. The city around her no longer felt threatening, no longer oppressive. The world was still full of mystery, full of unknowns, but she no longer feared it. She had faced her deepest fears and emerged stronger, more herself than she had ever been. And in that moment, Eleanor understood. The real prize was not winning the competition, not the applause or the recognition. The true victory was in finding the courage to be herself, to speak her truth, and to embrace the darkness without fear. The real magic lay in her own heart, and nothing, no shadow, no fear, could take that away. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Eleanor smiled softly to herself. She had found her voice, and it was louder than anything she had ever imagined.
Whispering echoes.